Hello everyone, my name's Gavin Boyter. Welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to give the second in a little series of talks about not just going over my thoughts about short story writing. This one is on the subject of setting, which is of course vital to any piece of fiction at all. Indeed any piece of writing really, descriptive writing. So I'm just going to go through a few of my thoughts on the importance of setting and how to make sure you have the right setting and that you've thought everything through sufficiently. So I suppose the first thing you need to know is the story you want to write is either going to be set in the present day, in a broadly speaking realistic sort of environment, or it's going to be a genre piece. And by genre, I'm using that term very widely to include everything from historical fiction to science fiction to horror to, well, pretty much anything that's not set in the here and now. Anywhere that you couldn't go and get on a plane, assuming that you're allowed to get on a plane, and go and visit. So even something like, even if you set a story in the 1980s, that would not fit within the remit of what I'm calling present day realism. So, there are slightly different rules apply depending on what you're doing. So if you're writing a genre piece, there's sort of three areas you need to consider. The first is obviously and first and foremost research. Research is utterly vital to any piece of writing, but particularly if you're writing about a setting that isn't somewhere that you can visit or have visited, or even somebody you haven't visited recently. I suppose in a genre context, an example of a writer who obviously does that fantastic well would be someone like Hilary Mantel or Patrick O'Brien. They're writing historical fiction. The entire world they're writing about is entrenched in a whole set of assumptions and an environment very different from our own. So research is key, and they, to be honest, they probably immerse themselves so much in the subject that their ideas grow from the research more than anything else. But you'd have to ask them. The other question you must ask yourself is whether you've achieved consistency, and by this I mean, both geographical consistency. Does it make sense? Can the viewer picture it? Do they understand where the harbour is in relation to the village? Do they understand how extensive the forest is? What kind of forest is it? Have you written an environment that seems some days to be tropical and other days more like a sort of very dry desert-like climate? Does that, you can't really just, unless you're writing science fiction or fantasy, you can't really meld the setting to suit your story. You've got to make the story fit within the setting. Either that or you've chosen the wrong setting and you might want to reconsider. But yeah, make sure it's consistent. Make sure it feels like a real place with rules, with a boundary of some sort, with its own populace who live within that region. Obviously, in terms of a short story, you don't need to go deeply into this stuff in a short story setting. You just have to make sure that whenever something is mentioned that relates to the setting, it is consistent with everything else that has gone before. That comes from research or familiarity, obviously. Another little subtle point that, which is very personal in the sense that I believe that if you have a setting where that is both magnificent and mundane, you're more likely to convince the reader that this is a real place, because life is magnificent and mundane. Great stories are that way. Everyone makes cups of tea, struggles to put their contact lenses in. What's the word? Just little minute details that are related to the environment specifically. A sailor might put notches on the side of their boat every time they've had a rough sea, or just some little detail that's unusual, some little thing that kind of roots the action and the character in that place, rather than just being a backdrop. You don't want it to seem like you've just put up a sort of a screen behind the characters and they're acting out their crises and conflicts in front of that screen. You need them to be melded into the landscape. And you can get that through little mundane details, little moments that aren't, exceptional in any way, except they just feel real and of that place. Whether someone drinks from a chipped mug or a mug where the handle's been stuck back together because they're working in an environment where they're having to make do with whatever they can find. Say a post-apocalyptic world, you make do with whatever you can get, or in a blitz scenario in a war, or there are lots of environments in which you can tell a lot about the setting, about the place that your story is taking place by the details, rather than always having to describe, the lay of the land, what the buildings look like, those kind of generic geographical details. It's not really just about that. And a writer who's very good on that is Ian Banks, or rather maybe Ian M. Banks, because his science fiction ideas are vast and colossal and universe building. But within that, he always has interesting little details and quirks, things that just root it in the real, things that we recognise in our lives, no matter how outlandish and vast his canvas is. If you're not writing genre fiction, if you're writing something rooted in the here and now, in the present day, I've sort of narrowed it down to 4, if you like, levels of knowledge that you might have of that place. Obviously, ideally, in a perfect world, every story you want to write would be set where you happen to live, And there are many writers who write consistently about one place, and they build a composite portrait through either short stories or novels or plays or whatever of that place. But your imagination may not want to be fixed into that one little location. However, if you have a place you've been to many times on holiday, a fascinating little village that you've stopped off at, or somewhere you've been forced to spend 9 hours at while you're waiting for something else to happen, even if it's a really boring place, a service station on the A1 could be a fascinating setting to set something in if you really know it well. So obviously places that you know very well are in some sense the easiest. Then there are obviously places that you've visited once or twice, you might know well, but you can recapture those memories, sense memories, through objects that you have, souvenirs, photographs, things you've written about the time that you spent there, social media. The next and more challenging level of knowledge of a place, I guess, is places that you have to research. In a short story, you can get away with this in a short story. You can get away with going online, looking at Google Maps, looking at photographs that people have taken of their neighbourhood, reading Wikipedia entries, reading personal journals of visiting those places, just doing a kind of cubist portrait, in terms of the research at least, finding different angles into a place that you haven't personally been to. And that will work if the story you're telling isn't so rooted in the place that you must know every detail. Or maybe you want to describe an episode within a story. The person grew up in a particular village. You don't need to give every detail of that village. You need to give a couple of little notes just to make it feel real. And the internet allows you to do an astonishing amount of research that was never possible 20 years ago. So make use of it. And then finally, if none of that suits, and something that obviously science fiction writers, particularly and fantasy writers, will is just their bread and butter, is places you've invented. Make something up, create a village, give it an entirely made up name. If you do that, it's almost worth making it clear to the reader that you've made this place up, rather than that you're trying to sort of excuse the fact that you haven't done research into a real place. You kind of want to make a virtue of the fact that you've created this perfect little laboratory in which to have your story take place. Again, it still has to be consistent. it still has to feel like you've researched it in a weird sort of way. You need to have the details. You need to know how big the forest is, whether there's a particularly strong spring. You just need to know enough details that make sense consistently. Okay, so some questions to ask yourself as you design your setting. Firstly, how essential is this place to this particular story? Does the connection between place and action feel arbitrary or deeply entrenched? Ideally, it feels deeply entrenched. It's a bit weird to set a story about. Let me think. Actually, it might be interesting, but trying to think of a combination that would just seem an arbitrary and strange choice. But actually, sometimes those can work. I mean, if you're going to write a story about gangsters, yeah, you could choose to write about Chicago or Sicily or, the East End of London, or you could write about gangsters in a small Cornish fishing village. But are you really likely to get that many gangsters in a small Cornish fishing village just because you happen to live in one? Just think carefully about whether your setting does match the story that you want to tell. If there's a mismatch, it actually creates comedy quite often, and that could be good. If you want to write a funny story, yeah, have gangsters invade your small Cornish fishing village and try and take over the local fish and chip shop. I mean, one of the greatest, I suppose almost an example of this is the Scottish filmmaker Bill Forsyth made a film called Comfort and Joy, which was based on a real story about the Glasgow ice cream wars. So this was, almost like a vendetta between rival gangster families, but set in the world of ice cream vendors and their vans, where eventually you'd hear the sound of the jingle, when that would become a menacing thing. And it actually did create this lovely sort of comic disjunct between the reality of what was happening, which is quite violent, and actually in reality it was much worse than he portrayed in the film. Between that and the sort of down-to-earth, sort of little, rather couthy, as we say in Scotland, environment in which the story is told, ice cream vendors. Anyway, figure out, does this place suit the story you're going to tell? The next question I suppose to ask is, to what extent do you need to convey a sense of place, and how are you going to do that? Do you need to tell the audience up front what kind of environment your story is taking place in? And that would be very important if you're writing a story of survival or endurance. I mean, we're not going to be very impressed about a character walking through a blizzard if we suspect it's just a few flurries of snow in a field. We need to know, what are the stakes here? What sort of distance would this person have to cross in order to get back to civilization? So I mean, again, from another genre, or from another medium rather, in the film 137 Hours, is it? The Danny Boyle film. He does painstakingly set up the size of that very arid landscape, and how barren it is, and how difficult it is to find a road, and how unforgiving the sun is, and all sorts of things, when he has the protagonist cycling, mountain biking through this place before he becomes trapped. So, yeah, to what extent in your story do you need to, I suppose you might say, are you doing a watercolour or an oil painting? Are you just gently brushing in a few details of setting? Or are you giving a really rich flavour of the place? And it depends on the kind of story you want to tell, obviously. So obviously, third, again, I'm going to bang on about this a few times. Have you done your research? Have you gone to all the sources that are available, online sources, books and maps, perhaps in library or on your shelves? Have you spoken to friends or relatives who've been there, if you haven't? And actually, you might consider potentially visiting a place if you want to write about somewhere that's within arm's reach, or assuming that the world allows us to travel again, because I'm saying this during the coronavirus era, But once that's done and dusted, maybe it's worth a visit. I mean, I didn't do this deliberately in the sense that I didn't go there because I wanted to fill in the details of these stories, but retrospectively it helped enormously. When I went to Romania on my endless epic running across Europe project, as detailed in the soon-to-be released book, Running the Orient. Anyway, during that trip, when my father was doing support duties for a couple of weeks, we took a morning off and we went to the ancient Dacian capital of, let me get this right, Sarmizegetusa. Sarmizegetusa. It's very hard to pronounce. Maybe I'll put it on screen. That place. This is fascinating. It's a pre-Roman ancient civilization, and there's not a lot left. There are basically the foundations of buildings, but you can see the structure of these religious buildings, and you can see enough to know that that was a proper civilization. They weren't, as the Romans thought of them, barbarians. They were called barbarians because they didn't believe in the Roman gods, and why would they? They had other deities to follow and other rituals. But when I wrote a script previous to that, it's a very genre piece. It's an action horror movie called Legion, and it pits Roman legionnaires on a scouting party during the war with Dacia, I think AD 107. It pits them against vampires, because I discovered that this was happening in what is now Transylvania, and it just made me go, oh, interesting. Maybe I can kind of mix in the vampire mythos with Roman legionnaires and see what happens. And of course, I kind of imagined. I did a little bit of research, and I found out that the area was largely forested and mountainous, and so I set it in a fairly wild location with crevasses and mountains and huge forests and a sort of spooky feeling where you might get lost at any minute. Even a very highly drilled Roman legion could become lost in the forest and be picked off by this hideous enemy. And I was very, very relieved to find that when we went to the place that I'd written about, that it was actually pretty similar to what I'd imagined. In fact, I feel like now when I go and do a rewrite, I'll be able to invest even more local detail and a richer sense of place into the script, having gone there. And also in Romania, on a much smaller note, I'd written a novel where a character was born in Bucharest and had a sort of romantic encounter by a particular fountain that I found on Google Maps. Dropped my little person on and looked around and saw this impressive fountain, ornate fountain. And on that same trip, I actually got to go there and found, to my relief, that it was exactly what I needed in the book. It might not have been, and if it hadn't been, then I would have found something else and gone back and changed it in the text. So that's the important lesson, is basically any way you can go to a place, whether it's virtually online through research or actually in person or vicariously through talking to friends, do that thing. Do that thing and then rewrite to make it work. Last question really is, I suppose, about your character, sort of linking character to place. Are your characters rooted in that environment? Are they visitors? Are they fish out of water? And to what extent are they, fish out of water? In my story Thermals, which is the fourth story, I may put a link in the text below, but you can find it on the channel. It's called Thermals. I have a female cartographer. Actually, no, she's a quantity surveyor. She's gone to basically find some land that would be flat enough to start construction work to create a observatory on this mountainside in Ecuador. And she is really out of her depth. She doesn't know the environment. She doesn't know the people. And she immediately has a sort of antagonistic stance towards the pilot of this plane. Although admittedly he's a bit of an alcoholic and perhaps not the safest person to fly with. But the fact that I knew that she was not really of that environment so much, that really helped to root her character, well, to set her in opposition to the environment. And so that really helped. And I did as much research into the mountain and the fact there'd been plane crashes there and the fact that it was often swathed in cloud and snow, and it's like conical and a volcano. And I sort of, I did a lot of research into that place and what the town of Quito was like, or how far that is from the mountain, that sort of thing. I needed to know the logistics. Now, once you have your place, once you know exactly where you're setting your story, try to make use of what is particularly unusual or unique about that place. I mean, after all, otherwise, why have you chosen it? Was it just an arbitrary choice? Or is there something specific in that place that will bring out a conflict, or bring out an interesting nuance of character, or allow an interesting plot to take place there? So I was thinking of some details of an environment that might be usable in terms of deepening character or creating a conflict. It would be something like the Northern Lights. You have a trek out to see them, you have the suspense of, are they going to appear, and when they appear, what does it do to the characters? Do people have different responses to them? In my latest story, I think number 44, I have featured the Northern Lights, but it's subtle. I mean, you don't hammer it home, but if you have a character sort of gazing at the Northern Lights in wonder, and then they're interrupted with something dramatic that takes the reader somewhere else. You've managed to convey this sense of wonder, and then now you're going somewhere else. It creates a disjoint, and that could be useful. Then they've got the sea. Obviously, the sea is vastly emotional and powerful. It's not just one thing. The sea, obviously, you can have a raging sea, a calm sea, a sinister sea, a very familiar, comforting sea, and I kind of wrote about that in the story called the Selkies Burrow, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. A forest, the forest, what kind of forest is it? In what sense is it unusual? Does it have a really strange little copse where all the trees are in a circle for reasons that aren't explained? Is it a forest? Is it a line of trees on the ridge of a steep rocky hill? What kind of forest is it? What's unusual or unique? Is there a road that, because I just got in Bulgaria, I had an amazing experience where Google Maps sent me along a road that clearly hadn't existed as a proper road for 60 or 70 years. And this place had been overtaken by the forest. So you have this sort of vaguely discernible shape of a flat road leading off through the woods, but it's collapsed in all sorts of different ways. There's things growing out of the middle of it. There's a huge 10-foot gap, a 20-foot wide gap with 10 feet deep of just rubble in the middle of this thing. God knows what happened there. That was unique. There's I think you'll see online, sometimes you get these like clickbait links on Facebook or something to like 10 or 100 amazing places that you won't believe exist, and then you'll see something like an abandoned theme park or roller coaster rides in the middle of a forest or something that have just been taken over by nature. It doesn't need to be that extreme, but you'll find there's always some strange, quirky little characteristic to a place that you might find you can hang something on. Now, in some genres, setting is so entrenched that it becomes a character in itself. And that I'm thinking of particularly horror, sci-fi, endurance or survival stories, ghost stories. In the latter category, I'm going to have some tea because my coffee, I forget to drink it. Lovely and lukewarm. I'm thinking of The Beach in Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which is the full title of that M.R. James story, famously filmed by Jonathan Miller with Sir Michael Hordern in a fantastic British black and white movie of the 60s, late 60s, I think. Anyway, it's a great story. The short story version is just as good as the film. It's absolutely entrenched in that particular rather wild, rather inhospitable and quite flat and featureless bit of seaside. I can't remember exactly where it is now, but I have it in my head from reading the story and from seeing the film. And he obviously had this notion of seeing something blowing along a beach, or finding a little flute with that little message on the side of it, whistle and I'll come to you. And it had to be in that place. There's no doubt that he could have found that flute in a forest, but there's something very rich about finding a little flute, a wind instrument, in a place that's constantly windswept, windblown. There's a resonance there. And the idea of meeting a ghost, or meeting a ghostly presence on a beach where there's nothing and no one, it can't have come from anywhere. How did it appear? So that's a very good example of a genre tale that makes the location become a character in itself. It can very clearly be the antagonist. In a survival story, the landscape, the geography is the antagonist, really. Something like Into the Wild. And so those stories are entrenched in place, and you absolutely have to detail what it is about that place that's antagonistic. You think about it the same way you would think about an antagonist. What does it want, in a sense? Does that make sense? What does the desert want? It wants everything to dry out and die, in a sense, you could say, if you really want to be existential about it. What does the sea want? It wants to reclaim things. It wants to pull things down to the depths. So think of it that way, in a sense. Now I'm going to give a few little examples of some stories where I used a very specific place and how that helped. In number 16, An Equation for Happiness, I had this very clear picture in my head. I don't quite know where it came from. I think it started with the little birds, being observed by the main character, who's a monk. And I thought, well, where could this be happening? I thought, well, he could be in a orangerie, which is part of his monastery. And he's under these wooden frames where there's vines hanging. And he's watching these little birds. And then I thought, well, I want my monastery to be remote in a way, because I want there to be a girl who comes and delivers food, the things they can't grow in their kitchen garden. And I wanted her journey to be challenging in some way. So I thought, well, I want it to be on a hillside. I want it to be a rocky track that she has to push her bike up, but she can ride back down. And I want the village to be a little bit remote. And then I want there to be a bay with the sea, so that she can look at that sea as she's coming back down and think about maybe leaving the village and going to the city. And the place became very crucial to both characters. One character feels very at home and comfortable there in the monastery, although they do have a sense of regretting things that they haven't done with their life. The other character has grown up in the village, visits the monastery, but sees that very much as a sort of stepping out of her place of comfort. It's a nice little place she can visit, but she doesn't feel she belongs there, really. And she doesn't really feel she belongs in the village either. So her sort of, she comes from that place but doesn't feel that it defines her, in a sense. And I use my mind's eye, in a sense. I don't really know how to explain the mind's eye, but from that image of the bird on the branch of the tree hopping around, I sort of built up an image of what the garden would look like, and that there'd be a high wall with a big wooden fence, a wooden gate in it, and that the monastery would be over there, and that behind the gate there'd be the cobbled path leading down the side of the mountain. So that it just sort of built up in my head. If I knew how to do that, I would tell you, but it just happened. In story 22, the Selkies Burrow, this is where I really got into this particular bit of coastline that I am familiar with on the west coast of Scotland, around Sandaig, Mallaig, looking over to Skye. And there is actually a whirlpool there called the Corrie Vrecken. But I didn't want to use that specific whirlpool because I didn't think it really fitted with the geography of how close it was to the village, etc., etc. So I sort of just created another one. I'm sure there are several places along that, between those islands and along that coastline, where waters come together and form whirlpools anyway. So what I knew about that place was how risky it is to go out in the wrong weather, how quickly the weather can change, how disastrous it can be. And that allowed me to come up with a character who was just very indefatigable and strong. You know, she's elderly, but she's not frightened. She knows the risks. She won't let anyone gainsay her or make her behave in a safe manner. She just goes out in her boat every day or twice a week to tend to her lobster pots. And I hope the sense of place comes across in that story. And finally, in the story The Ice Moon, where I, in a sense, had to invent a place, although it is based on Europa is a moon of Jupiter, and we do know something about it. But mostly I invented the details of what it would be like underneath the surface. So obviously I did some research. I've known for a while that it was a mostly largely liquid world under perhaps an ice crust. And there has been a film called Europa that I saw a long time ago, where it sort of explored what it would be like to visit. I can't remember exactly what. There's a scientific mission to Europa, and I think they get stranded. I can't remember exactly. But anyway, I invented a lot of it, but I grounded my inventions in research. So hopefully, obviously not the creatures and the strange living godlike entity that is at the heart of Europa, but the rest of it, you know, the science of how you would bore, how far you would have to bore through the crust, what it's made of, what you'd find underneath, what temperature it would be, you know, what sort of protection would you have to wear, what sort of vehicle would you have to use. That was all based on finding out what the environment of Europa would be like. So one final thought I would say is, if in your life to date you have been to an impressive place or a fascinating locale, whatever, consider setting a story there, because that place has obviously created a very powerful memory, and there's a reason for that. You know, it instilled an emotional response probably of some sort when you were there, and you can use that. You know, you can dig back into that in your story. So if there's a story that you want to tell and it would suit that location, then use it. Use all the photographs and the videos and the memories that you have. It will make the writing process easier. It will definitely strengthen your scenes, and it will ground character in place, which is the key thing, because you were there. You're familiar with it, you know it, and you can convey it to your readership. And those are my thoughts on the setting for your short story. So hopefully some of you will go and have a look at those stories that I've mentioned and how I've used place, and judge for yourself whether I've done it well, because you may disagree. So those are I think I mentioned stories number 4, 16, 22 and 30. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please make comments. Feel free to share this video and possibly subscribe to the channel. And I will speak to you soon. Bye-bye.